Well, thank you so much, Mara. Thanks to all of you. It is really wonderful to be with you. I wish very much I could be in person with you, but I was up on the East Coast speaking and preaching yesterday and just not back in time to join you all today in person. So grateful to be for making it possible for me to present virtually. I do have a screen share of some slides I'm going to share for the presentation. I'm going to try to get through these in about 20 minutes so that I can take questions that you all may have. So please be thinking about questions, and hopefully we'll have some time for dialogue before the end of the hour. So I am going to share my screen. Some of you, I don't know exactly who all is in the room. Some of you have probably seen some of this. Oh, great. Now I get to see the room. Some of you have probably seen some of this presentation before, but I do think that having definitions and a grounding in what we're talking about is so important. This first slide will show you where to find me and Baptist Joint Committee, or BJC, and Christians Against Christian Nationalism on the web and on all the platforms. So I hope that you, if you're not already, will be following us in some of these different places. Let's see here. Here we go. As Mara mentioned, BJC is the organization that houses the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. It's a campaign that we started back in 2019 on the national level, and we have recently expanded into local organizing projects, starting first in Texas because of both the urgent need to combat Christian nationalism in Texas, but also because of a diverse faith community that is committed to taking it on. And so that is why we chose Texas as the place that we wanted to start our work. I always think it's important that we begin with definitions so we have a common understanding about what we're talking about. And I want to first offer a definition of religious nationalism. Religious nationalism is a merger of national and religious identities and goals. And it's a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. And so with that kind of broader idea of religious nationalism, I want to center in on the specific problem of Christian nationalism in the U.S. context. I will have some QR codes on the screen. This will take you to some additional resources on the web should you want to go and look at those later. But the definition we use at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is this one. Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. Or put another way, Christian nationalism suggests that to be a true American, to be a real American, to be an American who belongs here, that one has to be a Christian. And not just any type of Christian, but really a white Christian, and one that holds certain conservative religious views that are often in line with conservative political priorities. Now, you can't understand Christian nationalism without understanding white supremacy. And that's because in the American context, that Christian nationalism, the roots of this ideology go far, far back, long before the founding of the country, really back to the doctrine of discovery, when the deadly heresy was advanced that it was God's will for European conquerors to conquer the land and to steal native lands, and then to engage in slavery and segregation. So all of this history of discrimination and violence, it was all justified in God's name. It's examples of the misuse of the Bible to justify oppression, slavery, genocide, and violence. It's a very old problem, but something that has relatively new terminology. And I want to talk through some of what some of the markers are for Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism relies heavily on this mythological history of America as a quote-unquote Christian nation. This history is a cherry-picked version of history that really overemphasizes the religious biographies of certain founders, while not dwelling on the religious views of others, but also cherry-picking certain quotes or certain anecdotes from history to try to tell a story that's very different from the actual history of the United States and the way that religious freedom was developed in the country over time. It's an exaggerated form of an American exceptionalism, and it places a very heavy emphasis on God's providential hand in American history and politics. I think as you're exploring a number of different justice issues in your conference, I think you can think about white Christian nationalism as the soil from which all these examples of discrimination and injustice are growing out of. White Christian nationalism is a root cause. And it's based on this mythology of America as a Christian nation, but it tells the story that God blessed all the history of injustice and inequality that's inherent in the founding, when the only people who held full citizenship rights were white, Protestant, Christian men who owned property. And because of its heavy emphasis on this history, white Christian nationalism continues to suggest that those are the people who are most deserving of full citizenship rights and belonging. And I think in your conversations and when you talk about white Christian nationalism, you can see how that very old idea continues to show up in new ways and ways in policies that are being advanced at the legislature in Texas and in communities across Texas as well. We also, meeting this week, of course, we have so many examples just over the past week of seeing white Christian nationalism on the national level. I had the opportunity to preach yesterday in a church in West Hartford, Connecticut. I preached out of the lectionary, which I'm sure many of you either preached out of or heard sermons from yesterday. And of course, Jesus's inaugural sermon that he delivered in Nazareth, which was read from the scroll of Isaiah. Well, Christian nationalism uses some of the Christian language, but it replaces it with this distorted vision of the gospel. In my sermon yesterday, I compared this inaugural sermon from Jesus with the inaugural address we heard from President Trump. And a summation, I think, of President Trump's speech really gets to the heart of it. First, of course, he declared that God had saved him to make America great again. So this is how I think a Christian nationalist reading of the gospel goes. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to make America great again. He has saved me to close our borders, to make the billionaires seated here even richer, to discriminate against transgender people, to end programs that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, to proclaim that this is America's golden age. We can just see how the stark contrast this Christian nationalist version of the gospel is with the gospel of love that is the holy book for so many of us. When we think about Christian nationalism, I do think it's important that we identify, particularly as Christians, that Christian nationalism is a form of idolatry, that it takes the gospel of love and replaces it with this false idol of power. And is also a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus. Jesus, who was always on the side of the poor and the oppressed and the captives, as we read yesterday in Luke 4, that Jesus was himself a victim of state power and violence because he dared to speak truth to power. But the Christian in Christian nationalism is much more about this ethno-national identity than it is about the gospel or the teachings of Jesus at all. Rather, Christian nationalism uses Jesus, and more specifically a fair-skinned white Jesus, as a mascot for its discrimination. It perverts theology and the gospel to bless and to justify all kinds of injustice and violence. And of course, we've seen these claims for so many years, and I think it is really stark, as I said, what's happening both on the national level, but also in Texas, when we see leaders trying to use this a grossly distorted version of our faith to justify violence and injustice against oppressed and marginalized communities. When we think about Christian nationalism and how to dismantle it, I also think we need to think about the difference between patriotism and nationalism. And I'm going to define patriotism here as a love of country. And like all other kinds of love, it must be freely chosen. It cannot be forced. We can love our country enough to want better for it. Nationalism, on the other hand, is an allegiance to country that demands supremacy over all of our other allegiances, including our allegiances to Jesus. And so I think an important question to ask ourselves and to lovingly ask our friends and neighbors is our patriotism causing us to sacrifice our religious convictions? If so, it no longer, I believe, is a healthy form of patriotism, and rather it has drifted into this unhealthy area of nationalism. When we're talking about Christian nationalism, I also want to leave us with an encouraging word. And here, I'm going to show you some statistics here from PRRI. This is from a survey that was actually taken in 2023. Results were released in early 2024. I was with Robert P. Jones of PRRI last week in Maryland, and he said that coming this week, they're going to release some updated numbers. So I'm just flagging for you all that we're about to have updated numbers of these. But they did extensive public surveys around attitudes surrounding Christian nationalism. And they plotted out these 4 orientations to Christian nationalism: rejectors, skeptics, sympathizers, and adherents. The adherents are those who answered questions that showed that they were most embracing of Christian nationalism. And those numbers were 10% of the population. Another 20% were not quite as bought into Christian nationalism, but still moving that way. So 20%. So when you look at this, and these are nationwide numbers, you'll see a strong majority of Americans are actually moving away from Christian nationalism, either skeptical of it or fully rejecting it. And I think this is an encouraging word to all of us to see that while this ideology is dangerous, while it is violent, and while it is increasingly, I believe, being leveraged in public policy debates and in rhetoric, it is not a majority view. I want to also show you, this is, again, based on the same data from PRRI, but they plotted it among the 50 states. And you'll see any of the states that are kind of in a blue color are above the national average of 30% of those who are moving towards Christian nationalism. But you'll notice that in Texas, that number is 37%. Above the national average, but still far from a majority of people. And I find this to be encouraging and discouraging at the same time. Encouraging that a majority of our neighbors are rejecting or at least skeptical of Christian nationalism. Discouraging because that is not what we see coming out of the Capitol in Austin. And this is where I think we can really see how anti-democratic this ideology is, how we've seen in a number of national investigative journalism articles that Christian nationalism is being pushed by billionaire funders who are buying seats in the legislature and running primaries in order to advance an extreme ideology that is far out of step with even a majority of Texans, even a majority in what is a conservative state. And so I let you know this to know that when we think about Christian nationalism, yes, we are advocating to people in the state house, in the state legislature, but we are also needing to advocate and get people on the ground more involved in our larger movement to push back against it. And that's how I believe we are going to see real change. Some examples of Christian nationalism, of course, the picture on the right here is from January 6th, 2021. And we've seen that is the insurrection was one of, I think, the starkest examples of how Christian nationalism was used to justify violence, to justify trying to overturn the lawful election results in that year. But I could just as well have put some pictures from the Texas Capitol last week, where we saw these prayer rallies being held in some of the meeting rooms in the Texas Capitol, where we saw people gathering outside to vote down and advance really anti-democratic measures in the Texas House and using faith as a justification for it. On the left is a picture from January 6, 2023, where Baptist Joint Committee helped organize a prayer vigil to draw attention to Christian nationalism and its impact on January 6th insurrection. And so I use this picture as an example to what I really believe you all are doing at this conference. It's not about taking faith out of the public square. It's about bringing our full selves into public advocacy. And if that includes a religious identification, to bring our religious identities into the public conversation, but to do so in ways that respect the pluralism of our democracy, that respect the separation of church and state, that respects religious freedom for all people. We are driven to a public advocacy because of our convictions of conscience. But our aim is not to install our own religious views into law and policy, but rather to create a society that works for all people, regardless of religion. And I think this difference between faith-based advocacy and Christian nationalism is really important for us to continue to draw lines between and to really call on our legislators and our other elected officials to respect as well. The presence of faith-based people in public advocacy is crucial in this moment. And sometimes it is particularly Christians, I think, who have one of the biggest callings and needs to counter the kind of Christianity that we're seeing often in advocacy driven by Christian nationalism. We also, of course, have examples of Christian nationalism even in our worship spaces. And so as you go back to your houses of worship and other religious communities, I just want to point to some resources we have at the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign for us to understand how our own theologies and our own worship practices have been impacted by Christian nationalism. And again, to call on us to do better in the work that we're doing internally so that we can be better external advocates when we're calling on trying to dismantle Christian nationalism. The final example I want to give is how we're seeing Christian nationalism in public school policy. And I know this is an area that we at BJC and Christians Against Christian Nationalism have worked very closely with Texas Impact on. I, again, make this presentation all over the country, and sadly, I have far too many examples and expertise on what is happening in Texas that is really instructive for people around the country to watch out for. So some of the things, and again, all of these things we have seen and will continue to see come up in Texas. We see attempts to push the teaching of the Christian nation mythology in place of a more honest history. This idea of Judeo-Christian values, sadly, I think you're going to hear this term a lot. And I really want to caution our use of it and also to think about helping people understand how really even though it is appearing or is wanting to give window dressing to inclusivity, and is actually quite dismissive of Judaism, to use it as only a modifier of Christianity. That Judaism is a distinct religion, and while we share some of the same holy scriptures, the way that our religions interpret those scriptures or use those scriptures is very different in a lot of cases, as is, of course, how different Christian denominations use the scriptures. There is not one Judeo-Christian religion that is the religion for all of the United States, and yet that is often how we hear this term used in legislation that is trying to push this Christian nationalist identity. We've seen it, for instance, in laws, one that Texas has already passed, which is really encouraging the posting or requiring the posting of In God We Trust in public school classrooms. And we have already seen filed this year another attempt to require the posting of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. I think we can expect that will be a large push, even though there is ongoing litigation about that issue happening right now just next door in Louisiana. We've also all been involved in pushing back against a curriculum for K through 5 students that would incorporate the teaching of Bible stories into the reading and language arts curriculum in ways that do not respect religious freedom, in ways that are not age appropriate or subject matter appropriate. That is, at least at this point, I think, not likely to be a legislative concern. It's something that's happening with the Texas Education Agency and now on the local level, but something to watch out for as bills are filed. Also, of course, content bans, book bans, and we've already seen it last session, a law to encourage the hiring of school chaplains. That's also a legislation that we want to be on the lookout for going forward. So what do we do to push back against Christian nationalism? Well, one is, that is really what we're trying to do at the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. I want to invite you, if you haven't already done so, to consider signing our statement of principles. We have more than 40,000 people who have joined the campaign through signing the statement. It's not the only way to join the campaign, but something that I encourage you to check out on our website and join if you have not already done so. Mara mentioned my new book, How to End Christian Nationalism, which came out last fall. I wrote this book for people who understand that Christian nationalism is a problem, but not sure exactly what they can do about it. And so I really drew on a lot of examples, including in Texas. I point to the example of State Representative James Tallarico as a Christian who is bringing his faith to bear into public policy, but again, in ways that are not furthering Christian nationalism and how effective that advocacy can be. I also talk about the school chaplain work and some of the other examples in Texas. And so would just want everyone to know about this resource if it would be helpful for your small groups, your church Sunday schools, or other gatherings that you might have. And then I'm so pleased that Mara, who is, of course, a leader in our North Texas organizing project, that she mentioned the work that we are doing. So the work in North Texas is a pilot project. We started it over a year ago. And we are continuing the work. And at the same time, we're taking lessons learned in Texas and trying to help communities all over the country who are interested in setting up organizing projects. And so we have a number of organizing projects going on in places like Minnesota, Indiana, North Carolina, Oregon, Wisconsin, Virginia, and Connecticut, and more. And so it's really exciting to see the enthusiasm among volunteers to have projects in their local communities. And I want to speak just for a moment, and I will stop sharing so you can see me, just about what the importance, I think, of local organizing. And I take what you all are doing there today as an excellent example of it. I want to encourage you in it. We are in uncharted and very dangerous days in this country when it comes to democracy. And I think what we are all feeling, I've heard the line a couple of times now, that last week was a really full year, right? That there was so much that's happening. And I want to really point out that this barrage of authoritarian action, that is very much a technique, that is very much a strategy of overwhelm for those of us to feel defeated, for not getting more actively involved, that leads to a sense of inevitability and, yes, despair. And an antidote to that is to go local, to do exactly what you're doing. I am preaching this message in audiences across the country to get your national news in a digest and get more actively involved in your state and localities, because these are the places where we encounter and meet and know our neighbors, that we encounter and experience the inescapable network of mutuality that Dr. King wrote about in his letter from Birmingham jail. It's a way to push back against individualism in our society and think more about the collective. And as disgusting as many of the displays of Christian nationalism are on the national level, most of the impacts of Christian nationalism are pursued and felt at the federal and at the local and state level. There is a concerted strategy to defund and attack public schools, to ban books, to engage in violence against marginalized groups, to enforce national policies like ICE raids at our schools and, yes, even at our houses of worship. And so what we are all called to do is to get more actively involved in the project of democracy at the state and local level. And so I just, in that, I'm literally preaching to the choir because you're already doing it, but I want to encourage you in the effort that you're doing and to say I really view this as an antidote to authoritarianism that we're seeing at the national level. And so with that, I've left at least 10 minutes, I think, for questions. I'd love to engage in any kind of dialogue with you all.